Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo Wine Info video, and today we're going to be talking about South Africa's top 10 Sauvignon Blancs for the year 2024. And then through that lens, we will look at our wine of the day, which is the inevitable Fumé Blanc. Now, Sauvignon Blanc nerds are the absolute best type of wine nerd out of all the categories of wine nerds, because first of all, they are not just okay with discovering or making epic wines. More than that, they want to unpack and dissect and study and find correlations between chemical analyses and sensory analyses. And their goal, most of the time, is to really make life more interesting for the consumer. This last bit is particularly important because Sauvignon Blanc, with its broad range of expressions, can be a particularly complicated category to navigate for someone who isn't a wine expert. Now, Dr. Karine Coetzee is on the panel of the South African Sauvignon Blanc Association, and she puts together some absolutely incredible presentations on exactly this topic. So what we're going to do is look through some of her work and take 4 insights about Sauvignon Blanc in South Africa in the year 2024. The first thing is to divide up the general categories of taste and aromas into things like minerality, which, as I've said before, can be a whole bunch of things, and I've left a link to a video on that at the end of this. But then there are other things too, like herbaceous or stone fruit or citrus. So these are all categories that pop up when talking about Sauvignon Blanc, and I guess this starting point is quite useful to give us a framework for talking about what they taste like and how that correlates to quality, if anything. And we can talk about that connection later on. The first thing we notice when looking at the top 10 is that there's no single dominant region. Now, in South Africa, some of our cooler regions love to lay claim to producing the best Sauvignons. Constantia in particular really flies the Sauvignon Blanc flag very high. But then there are also regions like Elgin and Agulhas and Walker Bay. But when we look at the top 10, we don't necessarily see that pattern emerging. We see 2 wines from Stellenbosch, another 2 from Agulhas. Well, one says it's from Elim, but that's in the middle of the Agulhas region. And then there are 2 from Durbanville, and the final 4 are spread amongst other regions. The second insight is that South African winemakers are getting a lot better at working with Sauvignon fruit and oak barrels. Dr. Karine Coetzee pointed out that 4 or 5 years ago, there was maybe 1 barrel fermented Sauvignon Blanc in the entire top 10. And in 2024, there are 6. Of course, it's not a linear straight line graph towards being 100% barrel fermentation. But it would seem, and I think Tim Atkin agrees with this, that the rate at which winemakers are getting better at Sauvignon and barrel combinations is faster than the rate at which winemakers are getting better at tank fermented Sauvignons. The third insight is that as far as the association is concerned, quality is not flavor neutral. Because what we discover is if we look at all the possible flavors with Sauvignon Blanc, we find the highest scoring wines tend to congregate in a certain sector of that wheel. Put another way, if you produce a Sauvignon Blanc that has lots of green fruit flavors like greengage and kiwi and perhaps lime, and put that Sauvignon Blanc into a barrel which adds notes like nutmeg and cinnamon and perhaps some caramel or toffees, your chances of getting a high score from a critic are greater than if perhaps you produced a tank fermented Sauvignon Blanc that tasted of pineapple and passion fruit. Now, of course, this is philosophically dangerous because the moment you allow one small group of people to tell everybody what they can or can't enjoy, you potentially blind the consumer from enjoying other categories of Sauvignon Blanc. Now, this is not what the panel is trying to do, but it can be an unforeseen side effect. And probably the greatest example that I'm aware of that communicates this point is when Dr. Gabriel Lepousset from the Pasteur Institute was presenting French wines from Bordeaux to a group of Chinese businessmen. And he was trying to communicate what a bad vintage tastes like. It was a wine that had quite pronounced vegetal notes of capsicum and green pepper. And when he pointed the note of green pepper out to the group through his translator, they looked at him puzzled. And the translator had said, "We have no idea what a capsicum is or green pepper is." So he said, "No worry." And he took out a phone and he showed them a picture. He said, "Can you taste this in the wine?" And the translator said, we don't even know what that is. So almost exasperated and unable to communicate his point of what a bad wine should taste like, he said, "Well, what does the wine taste like to you?" And they all answered almost unanimously, "It tastes of ginseng." And he asked, "Well, do you like ginseng?" They said, "We love ginseng." So that wine that was meant to be a visual aid or a sensory aid as an example of a bad wine was something that impressed the entire room. So the question is Is it a bad wine? Or, in the context of a group of Chinese businessmen in Hong Kong, is it an absolutely fantastic wine? That's just a little philosophical point for you to debate as you drink this bottle. The fourth and final insight that comes from Dr. Karin's report revolves around the use of yeast in winemaking. Generally speaking, wine snobs see lab-cultivated yeast that you inoculate into the must at fermentation as an inferior boogeyman because it's artificial. It doesn't use the beautiful, elegant, natural native yeasts that float in the air and live on the grapes. But it's interesting to note that in the 2024 Top 10 Sauvignon Blancs, 7 out of 10 made some use of lab-produced yeast strains. Admittedly, some of them were a combination of native yeast and lab yeast, but the point is that the quality and complexity of the yeast coming out of labs is much better than it used to be. People who are fans of native yeast only would say you can't possibly get the same level of complexity as you get from native yeast because it's a whole bunch of yeast strains that come together to form a beautiful, mystical whole. But what labs have started to do is take yeast strains that do deliver a number of different effects and combine them into products that are available on the market. And so when, as a consumer, you're drinking these wines, you definitely get a sense of that complexity and layered texture that comes from traditional native yeast, even though you might be using a lab-produced yeast. Today's wine of the day is a barrel-fermented Sauvignon Blanc that has been produced by the former future world champion javelin thrower. Put another way, if you believe in the butterfly effect, it may just be that a 2006 vintage of I Am One by Armani could be the thing that robbed the entire world of one of its greatest javelin throwers ever. Because the winemaker who made today's wine is Neville Lotz, the South African 2003 javelin champion. And he had set a 5-year path towards the 2008 Olympics, where he would surely have become world champion. But during those 5 years, he made the terrible misstep, or perhaps the fortuitous change in direction, to one night under the stars taste the I Am One Armani 2006. And that single sip of the nectar of the gods made his brain say something along the lines of, holy shit, holy shit. Yes. It was that single experience that triggered a metamorphosis in Neville and robbed the world of a titan athlete. But bestowed upon the world a very gifted winemaker, and some might argue that is more worthwhile. On his winemaking journey, Neville trained under Cape winemaster Rudolf Steenkamp, and over the last 5 years, Inevitable Wines has garnered an incredible reputation, with many of his wines being served in Michelin-starred restaurants across Europe, and also impressing local chefs. You'll find his wines on the wine list of some really impressive South African restaurants, including Fane, Beyond, Aubergine, and Cape Town's Marble. But just because chefs love his wine, that doesn't mean that you have to. Before we get to taste the wine, it's interesting to note that the fruit for this wine came from a vineyard that is sitting at a ridiculous altitude, almost 500 meters above sea level. It is up on one of the highest hills in Stellenbosch, right on the boundary between Bottleray Hills Ward and Devon Valley Ward. For any Sauvignon Blanc nerd looking at this vineyard, it's an absolute dizzying wine theory merry-go-round. Because, for starters, Bottleray Hills is generally known as a warm region, but the vineyards are ridiculously high up, which makes it cool again. But we know that these are bush vines, so a lot of the fruit hangs lower to the ground, which means you get a lot more terrestrial radiation, which makes it warm again. But this is a slope that doesn't face north like the rest of the Bottleray. In fact, it faces south, so it's cool again. So we really have no idea what to expect. The only way to be sure is to get into the glass and taste it for ourselves. When we give it a sniff, it's certainly not green and vegetal. We actually get a lovely mix of colors. If we think back to Karin's wheel, we get some lime and also some kiwi fruit, but on the more orange side, we get ripe citrus and also touches of nectarine. Finally, there are very subtle hints of butter toffee and maybe some nutmeg. And this makes sense because, as we said, it is a barrel fermented Sauvignon, and oak does lend those flavors of cinnamon or nutmeg or caramel or toffee. When I asked Neville, hey man, you picked such an incredibly spectacular vineyard, what makes you want to add oak onto this instead of just letting it be a tank fermented Sauvignon and let the fruit speak for itself? And his answer was quite simple. He feels oak generally elevates Sauvignon Blanc, and which reminded me of a term that the French use, especially in regards to Chardonnay. By putting Chardonnay wine into a barrel, the term is élevage, which is the same word used for raising a child. And I find that philosophical connection between maturing a wine and adding complexity being connected to the raising of an infant into a complex adult is a beautiful mental image. When we give it a sip, well, we do get a really pleasant Chardonnay-esque mix of lime fruit and citrus, which is really rather tightly coiled and beautifully juicy and bright. And that is then softened as slightly sweeter notes of perhaps some peach, and then that sweet oak spice starts floating onto the palate. There might even be a little touch of pineapple in there, but one must be very careful when using a note like pineapple, because there are some wine critics who believe that pineapple and high quality are absolutely mutually exclusive. Another nice little evolution that happens on the palate is that initial tightly coiled bright citrus acidity softens in this kind of a creaminess that emerges, which I would imagine is partially due to lees contact and some malolactic conversion. But whatever the reason is, it's an absolutely spectacular wine. If this is your first exposure to Inevitable and you find that you love this wine, you'd be stoked to know that he has an entire range, which includes a Syrah, a Chardonnay, an Old Vine Chenin, and an Old Vine Colombard. Now that's all we have time for today, but I have left links to 2 videos which I think will help you go deeper on the topic. One of these videos is a visual aid that uses actual toast to explain how barrel toasting changes flavors in a wine, and the other is a video on how different viticultural styles can drastically alter the style of a wine.